Welcome to Plain Civics. Thank you for joining us. I'm Joe Ulery.
And I'm Bobbi Fisher.
Our goal is to break down how government works so you can make the government work for you. And we are to episode 13, Bobbi. We're going to tackle that today. But before we do, it's time for the Fast Five.
The Fast Five.
And question one, prefer texting or calling?
Generally texting, unless it's something that includes a lot of details, like if I need to call you, for example, editing the podcast. But generally, I don't like to talk on the phone.
Yeah, guilty. Same. I'm the same exact way. All right, number two, singing or dancing?
I laughed. I put ha-ha under dance.
Yeah, I don't think anybody wants to see me
singing,
dance.
But like, there's only a few people I'll sing in front of.
Know your audience.
In the car, I'm good.
All right. I would have picked singing, too. What is your dream car? This is one I think you have picked out.
Yeah, I just was deciding would I want a classic one or a newer one, but a red Challenger Hellcat.
Nice.
So,
speed.
You know, either, and they're not making them now, but last year was the last year, but it's Hemi, you know. Or I would take a classic one with an original Hemi in it.
That would be awesome.
But it has to be red.
Has to be red. All right, number four, what would be your favorite meal? I didn't say last meal, but favorite
You know, I
meal.
thought last meal when I was thinking this. What would I want? Start with French onion soup, made the classic way.
Yeah.
And then prime rib and baked potato with just butter and a salad.
We could share a meal of your favorite meal because I would eat all that stuff. I'm a picky eater.
Find a good place.
Yeah, and then I know your favorite president is Abraham Lincoln. I've asked you that, so I thought, all right, who is her second
Oh my gosh.
favorite?
This was a tough one. I wrote 3 different names down here because I'm not really sure which one I would pick. I had FDR, JFK, and James Madison.
Wow, all big ones.
And I even kind of thought Obama maybe would go in that category too, but not really sure I could say. Probably would lean to Madison because he had such an impact on our Constitution. But the other ones had great qualities as well.
That's the Fast Five for this week. Bobbi, thank you for your candor. Let's get started with the show. Where are we going?
And now our feature presentation.
So I put a title on this, What is the Electoral College and why do we elect our president this way? I thought a lot of people think that. It seems like kind of a weird, silly, whatever adjective you want to put on, way to elect a leader. So how'd we get there? Well, if you've listened to our previous episodes, then you know that the framers of the Constitution debated quite a number of issues over the course of 4 months, often returning to them to debate them again and again. If you look at the list, I posted the link on our Facebook page for the daily activities during the convention. You can just skim through there and see how many times they went back to certain issues again and again and again. And this was one of them. It actually comes later, and some issues took longer to resolve, such as the issue of representation in Congress. But another of the highly debated issues was the president. Remember, they were fearful of giving a single person too much power because of their recent experience under King George III, so much so that under the Articles of Confederation, they did not even include an executive branch or a leader, a specified leader of any type. But many felt that there needed to be an executive for specific purposes, somebody to lead foreign affairs and manage the treasury and so forth. So the framers wanted to give the executive branch of the new government enough power and independence to fulfill its responsibilities. They wanted an executive branch that had the capacity to act quickly when needed for the common defense, to preserve the public peace and deal with international relations, but within the system of checks and balances that they had created. They did not want to give an executive any power or independence that could be abused. The executive branch was not discussed at all at the convention, really, until after the legislative branch was pretty much worked out. Once they had what becomes the first article of the Constitution down, in other words, how Congress would be structured and work, then they worked on the executive branch. And they felt they needed to establish an executive that was strong enough to check the power of the legislature, but not so powerful that it could endanger a Republican government. In other words, they did not want the executive to become a king.
Right.
They debated having more than one executive, but decided that it would be easier for Congress to keep a watchful eye over one executive. And they were afraid that, if you had multiple executives, there would likely be power conflicts between the two of them, or however many there were. Now, we already discussed the decision to set a 4-year term for the executive, and that there would be no limit to the number of times they could be reelected. In fact, term limit on the president doesn't even happen until the 22nd Amendment, which is passed in February 1951. So we're a long way from there being limits on the presidential terms. But up till 1951, only one person had ever succeeded even in being elected more than twice, and that was Franklin D. Roosevelt. He ran and was elected 4 times. Of course, he did not get to finish out his 4th term as he died. Prior to Roosevelt, there had only been a handful of times that we had a president who had been elected and served 2 terms who considered running for a 3rd. But most of the time, they decided to follow the precedent that had been set originally by George Washington and stop after serving 2 terms as president. Since 1951 and the 22nd Amendment, that's a non-issue.
One thing I look at, too, taking the last 10 previous presidents, it's a job that really you can see how it aged.
Yes, exactly.
You look at photos of when they started and 4 years
All
later.
of them, yes.
Yeah. So I think that's a factor too.
I think it takes a toll. The big issue left for the framers was how to elect the executive. They briefly discussed the idea of direct election by the people, but rejected that because they felt citizens of such a large country would not know the best candidates because they might be from far away. And remember, they don't have modern TV, radio. There were newspapers, but it took a long time to get information because of lack of decent and speedy transportation.
And when you're saying direct election, or you're talking about popular vote.
Right,
okay.
Right. And they were also concerned that many common citizens would not have the information that they needed to make such an important choice, but also because there was this lack of communication, speedy communication, and education was lacking in the U.S. Very few people had an extensive amount of education at the time that we're talking about. But again, since the presidential candidate might not be from their area, might be a person that's not familiar to them. So many were just fearful that citizens directly electing a president might not be a good idea at the time. Now, George Mason, who we've talked about before, who was from Virginia, he actually said during the course of the Constitutional Convention when they discussed this, he said allowing the people to directly elect the president was like entrusting, quote, a trial of colors to a blind man.
Wow.
And that was the end of the quote. Many delegates from small states also felt direct election of the president would give the more populous states an advantage. Some felt it would be difficult to agree on candidates for direct election. As far as indirect election, the 2 most common proposals at the convention were either for Congress or for the state legislatures to elect a president. Eventually, the idea of using a temporary group elected for the purpose of selecting the president was proposed by one of the special committees at the convention, and this was done as a compromise between letting Congress or the state legislatures choose a president or using popular vote. So this was the compromise between those two. Their proposal became what is now known as the Electoral College. Now, before I go into the specifics about their proposal, let's look at the definition of college, because the first meaning given in the Oxford Dictionary is the one we usually think of as an institution of higher learning, but that's not what is meant by the Electoral College. The second definition is, quote, an organized group of professional people with particular aims, duties, and privileges, and it just happens to be that they use as an example for that second definition, the Electoral College.
Perfect.
So, this is a group of people that have a specific aim to elect or choose the president of the United States.
They got one job.
One job, and it's temporary.
Yep.
and it's not always the same people. So that's why they called it the Electoral College. Now, we're going to kind of get in the weeds here a little bit. This was the actual numbered proposal from the committee as to how to set up the Electoral College vote. One, they said the Electoral College would be organized once every 4 years to select a president. After the election, the college would be dissolved. Two, each state would select members of the Electoral College who would be known as electors. Each state legislature maintained control over how and by whom that state's electors would be chosen. 3, each state would have the same number of electors as it had senators and representatives in Congress. 4, each elector would vote for 2 people, at least one of whom had to be a resident of a state other than the elector state. This forced the elector to vote for at least one person who might not represent his particular state's interests. 5, the person who received the highest number of votes, if it was a majority of the electors, would become president. The person who received the next largest number of votes would become vice president, which at the time was a vaguely defined office devised near the end of the convention. And I'll point out in just a few minutes, we're going to talk about that this number 5 that they put into law actually didn't work. They find that out in the election of 1800, but we're going to come back to that.
Okay.
And finally, number 6 in their proposal is that if the top 2 candidates received the same number of votes, or if no one received a majority vote, then the House of Representatives would select the president by a majority vote, with each state having only one vote. In case of a vice presidential tie, the Senate would select the vice president, with each senator casting one vote. It sounds complicated and unusual, but they felt that this was the best solution. They felt that this method of electing a president would balance regional interests, prevent tyranny of the majority, so the majority from having an unrestrained exercise of power. It would promote national consensus, and it would provide stability and certainty, and it would address contemporary concerns, which I think by that they meant the fact that the country was so large and spread out, and that there was a lack of what they thought of educated people to make these big decisions. On a side note, the Electoral College also gave the slaveholding southern states an outsized influence in presidential elections because of the 3/5 compromise, which we talked about in a previous episode. Since those states were allowed to count 3/5 of their slaves for population purposes, this increased their number of representatives in the House and their number of electoral votes.
Just to put a fine point on that, they could count their slaves 3/5 of each person. But that slave didn't get a say, right?
That's exactly right.
Wow.
Now, the actual wording that explains the Electoral College can be found today in Article 2, Section 1, Clause 3 in the Constitution. This clause had to be amended. Here's what I was talking about a few minutes ago. The clause had to be amended after the 1800 presidential election, as Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr both received the same number of votes, and the tied election had to be decided by the House of Representatives. Now, leaders felt that this was a flaw, and it was fixed by the 12th Amendment, which was ratified in June of 1804.
So 4 years later.
Right before the next presidential election. So that part, the president is the most votes, vice president, and what happens in a tie, they found out almost right away that didn't work very well. So here's an instance of using the amendment process to fix something pretty early that they saw as a flaw in the system. So what it did when they ratified the 12th Amendment, it separated the voting into votes for president and votes for vice president, and this led the U.S. closer to having political parties, because we don't quite have them yet in 1800. There are what I think they would have called factions, but they weren't just quite considered set political parties yet. Now, let's put this in simpler terms. When you vote in a presidential election, you are not voting directly for the candidate. Instead, you are voting for electors chosen by each state's political parties. Each political party appoints its own set of electors. The winner of the popular vote will determine which political parties' electors get together at their state capitals to cast their official ballots on the first Tuesday after the second Wednesday in December. Yes, that is exactly how it's worded. So you have to figure out the first Tuesday after the second Wednesday. That's when electors of each state all at the same time, get together to cast their electoral votes. After the electors meet and their ballots are cast and signed by all of the electors, they are sent to the U.S. Archives and the president of the Senate, who is the vice president. The vice president then oversees the official counting of the Electoral College votes at a joint session of Congress. Now, I'm going to stop for just a minute.
Okay.
This is, what caused the problems back in January of 2021.
That's exactly where my mind went, because we learned so much that we probably wouldn't even have knowledge of during that process, because this played out minute by minute on the national news.
It's officially something that has to take place, although it's really more or less ceremonial that they, the vice president's there in front of a joint session of Congress to count the votes. They've actually already been counted. The archives, and each state has taken care of that. But it's a ceremonial thing to show that the process is done. Here's what the count was. And of course, that was interrupted by the events on January 6th. 2021.
In fact, I remember on the news the ballot box during the incident on January 6th. Somebody rescued that and saved it.
It was with Pence, Vice President Pence, as he was ushered to a safe spot, yes.
And it was a really historic box, ballot box. I mean, they've been using that for years and years and years, and somebody thought, oh, we've got to grab that and preserve it.
These are rituals that have been done since the beginning of our time.
And that reinforces the ceremonial process of what is happening.
On that day, that's when the winner of the presidential election is officially certified. Now, just kind of some numbers here. Currently, in 2025, there are 538 total electoral votes, and that's based on the fact that there are 100 senators, because each state has 2, and there are 435 members of the House of Representatives, and each state has a different amount. Indiana has 9. I believe California has the most.
Wow.
They have a much, much larger population. Texas, I think, is second, and New York. And then there are 3 representatives from Washington, D.C., although they're not a state, but they get some representation. And so to win, a person must win 50% plus 1 of the electoral votes possible. 50% plus 1 of 538 is 270. That's why if you're watching the election results, in November, they're saying so-and-so is up to, this many electoral votes. And that's why 270 is kind of that magic number.
Yeah.
Yes. Now, the burning question today is whether the Electoral College is still relevant, and is it still a viable method for electing our president? First of all, most people have their own view of whether the answer to that is yes or no. But let's keep in mind first, changing the Electoral College would require a constitutional amendment, which is a difficult and lengthy process. It's obviously not impossible, as besides the first 10 amendments or the Bill of Rights, we've added 17 others in 200 years. But that's not a lot that's been added, and it's because it is a difficult and lengthy process. First, an amendment must be proposed either by a 2/3 majority vote in both the House of Representatives and the Senate, or by a constitutional convention called by 2/3 of state legislatures. So one of 2 ways to propose an amendment. Then the proposed amendment has to be ratified by 3/4 of the state legislatures or by conventions in 3/4 of the states. The high threshold makes changing the Electoral College a significant challenge, as it would require widespread support across not only the political spectrum, but also among the states and the citizens of the states. Another possibility that I would say is probably a more likely way, if we're ever to change the way the Electoral College is used, wouldn't change it in the Constitution, but there are some states that have passed what is known as the National Popular Vote Plan, also known as NPV for short, which is an agreement among participating states to award all their electoral votes to the candidate who wins the national popular vote, regardless of who wins in each individual state. Let's just kind of put that in perspective for a minute. So in other words, Indiana has 11 electoral votes. votes. We're not one of the states that has approved the NPV yet, but if we did, what that would mean is instead of, like, let's say the Republican candidate wins the most votes in Indiana, but overall they don't. Over the whole United States, they are not the winner. We would go with the person that got the most popular vote, even though they might not be the Republican, or vice versa. So that's how it would change if we had the NPV in place. Now, if enough states join this compact to control a majority of the electoral votes, which is 270 or more, it would effectively ensure that the candidate who wins the popular vote becomes president. And this would help address some criticisms of the Electoral College by making every vote count equally, reducing the emphasis on swing states, and potentially it could increase voter turnout, because then those people that are skeptical about voting and then, the other candidate who doesn't even win the popular vote gets to be president, that's what turns a lot of people off.
I think it's a good time to point out, too, that some of the last presidents that we have elected were elected. This isn't some far-fetched thing. They didn't win the popular vote.
Exactly. We've had that happen a couple of times in recent history. Now, this would not eliminate the Electoral College itself, as the existing constitutional framework would stay intact. The National Popular Vote Bill would guarantee the presidency to the candidate who receives the most popular votes in all 50 states and the District of Columbia. By the end of 2024, just to let you know how the progress of the NPV is going, it's been enacted into law by 17 states and the District of Columbia, which is Washington, D.C., for a total of 209 electoral votes with those 17 states and the District of Columbia. So we need to get a few more states, because we need at least 61 more electoral votes for this NPV to go into effect. What I'll do is, there's more information on this, and I'll post a link on our Facebook page for people that might want a little more information on the National Popular Vote Plan. Because maybe if more people become aware that this is a possibility, they can push their states to move towards it.
And 61, if you have the right combination of states, maybe a handful of states is all it takes.
Exactly. So this is a possibility to make a change without having to do it by amendment. Now, the other question we're going to end with is, how do we combat citizen non-voters who claim that they don't vote in elections because their vote doesn't count? And again, this mostly has to do with voting in the presidential elections because of the Electoral College. So what can you say to those people to encourage them to participate? One, I think you have to emphasize that every vote counts in shaping the country's future. While the Electoral College can seem to diminish the impact of individual votes, especially if you're in a non-swing state, elections still determine other key local, state, and national positions and policies. Voting is a crucial way to voice your opinion and influence decisions that affect your life and your community. Additionally, increased voter turnout can lead to more representative and responsive government, strengthening the democratic process overall. And I'll just add, and I think we've mentioned this before, in the last couple of elections, we've had about 60% or less voter participation, which, when people say, well, they won majority of the vote. Well, they won a majority of 60% of our citizens that could vote.
Right.
But not a majority of eligible voters, eligible citizens, let's say.
Yes, Electoral College for the president does make it feel like some people say, well, my vote won't count. But as you mentioned, yes, your vote counts when it comes. Definitely every single vote counts when you're voting for your U.S. senator. Every single vote counts when you're voting for your U.S. House of Representatives candidate or mayor or governor. Every one of those
And we
count.
can kind of think of it in, I would call it a reverse way, too. All those, the 40% of people staying home, what if they had been educated or, understood enough to make a good choice when they vote, put in their vote? And what if they had voted? The outcome might have been different than with just 60% of people giving their vote. So
hopefully one day we'll know, because people will become more educated and more people will vote. So hopefully we'll know the answer to that.
That is the hope.
One day.
Maybe this will make them understand more that their vote is important.
Very important.
And anymore, it takes so little time. I remember when earlier voting, you had to go. A lot of times you had to wait in line. In Cass County, they may have only had like 3 booths that you could go in.
On one day.
And you had to, on the same day. Yes, that's important. Now you know, most places, or many places anyway, have multiple days that you can vote. The machine's little. You don't have to wait for the curtain to open. Like I know where I usually go vote, there's probably at least 20, maybe more machines sitting there. So, you know, you're doing 20 people at a time instead of 3, and it's much quicker.
And
anyway.
sometimes it's on the weekend.
Right.
So you don't have to.
I always go on Saturday now. You know, you can't use the excuse, well, I can't get off work, or, you know, it takes too long. The line in November this last year, even on a Saturday, it was longer than it had been, but we were still in and out of there in probably 15 minutes.
Yeah.
And I've gone in before where I've just walked in, gone right up there, voted, and out 5 minutes.
Yeah. Well, hopefully more and more people will educate on how to vote and participate in the process. So thank you for explaining this. This has been one of my favorite episodes because there's always that mystery of how in the world does this work? And, you know, I think I've got it now, but I'm going to go back and re-listen to this episode to make sure. So where are we headed next?
So in the next episode, we're going to talk about how the Bill of Rights came about and just kind of do an overview of it. In future episodes, we'll actually break down some or all of the actual 10 amendments that make up the Bill of Rights. We can't do that in 25 minutes. So, but, you know, we're going to talk about how it came about, what's in it, and then, like I said, we can expand on it in future episodes.
So stay tuned for when that drops. Now it's time for the pop quiz.
Last episode, the question was, what is meant by freedom of religion? And the answer is, you can practice any religion or none at all and not be persecuted. One of the reasons a lot of the English came over here to begin with was they wanted to practice a religion, and England said, no, you have to practice the Anglican Church, which translated into the Church of England. And they didn't want to do that. First Amendment's important because it allows us to have numerous religions. And if you don't believe in any, that's fine too.
And our nation isn't based on any certain religion, is it?
No. And for exactly that reason. Because in England, the government basically ran the church. And that was the only church that could exist there at that, you know, in the 1700s. So they wanted our country to be free of religious, not necessarily influence, but in the government.
So freedom of religion. You can practice any religion or none at all and not be persecuted. So that's the answer. And where do we go next?
So our question for this time is, what stops one branch of government from becoming too powerful? And I will give a hint, although if you were taking the citizenship test, this hint would not be there. There are 2 things that you need to mention. To what keeps one branch of government from becoming too powerful? 2 things.
That's the question. All right. There are 2. Do you have to have both or just one?
In our system, you need both.
All right. So we'll get to that on the next episode. Bobbi, thank you for making 9 pages explain the electoral vote system for the Electoral College system. That you should save that and turn it in for an A. Thank you for all of the research on that. And we'll see you next episode. That's it for this one of Plain Civics, breaking down the basics, no politics, just facts. Thanks for listening, and until next time, stay informed and stay engaged.
This is Plain Civics. Join us for the journey as we break down the basics of how government works so you can make the government work for you.